all respect has to go to Todd and Badad and the Boehly Clearlake. Normally, you'd expect something like that to take about a year, and they ended up doing it in less than 3 months.
Why haven't the funds for these humanitarian causes been released yet?
Overall, he wouldn't have sold if he didn't have to. There's lots of cause for optimism.
Hi, my name is JJ Święcicki and I'm a Chelsea supporter. I welcome all English-speaking fans to my channel. Today's conversation is special, that's why I've decided to drop this video in two languages, English and Polish. You can find the link to the Polish versions below. I'm talking to Nick Purewal, the author of the book Sanctioned, the inside story of the Chelsea sale, who reveals details of the sale to me and addresses many important issues. I invite you to follow my channel and my social media profiles. The links are below. Finally, I would like to note that this interview was recorded in the autumn of the last year. Thank you for being with me and enjoy watching.
Was there a genuine risk that Chelsea could have ceased to exit?
Absolutely, yes, there was. Is the short answer to that question. And so when the Ukraine war broke out, when Russia stepped up their invasion of Ukraine, obviously that changed the picture greatly for the whole of Europe and the whole of the world. And when the UK government sanctioned Roman Abramovich on the 10th of March, that then meant that Chelsea fell under the same sanctions. So the government had to issue a temporary operating license to allow Chelsea to complete that season. And that license expired on the 31st of May, 2022. And the government made it very clear that they wouldn't extend that license or grant a new one. So the sale had to be completed by that deadline. And if the sale hadn't been completed by that deadline, that would have been the outcome that Chelsea would have fallen into administration. So everyone who was involved in the sale had to work very, very hard to make sure that could be done in about a quarter of the length of time it would have taken otherwise. So it could have, normally you'd expect something like that to take about a year, people were telling me, and they ended up doing it in less than 3 months. So remarkable that they managed to get everything done.
Your book portrays the British government as bumbling and unwilling to operate with Chelsea. Did I get the right impression?
I think that's definitely the feeling that a lot of people had. But I would have sympathy for them in some respects, because they were trying to, the sanctions that they had to impose across all sectors. And it was the first time they were ever having to deal with something of that scale, to be honest. Brexit and the UK leaving the European Union meant that for the first time in anyone's careers who were handling the sanctions, that they had to implement them, to put them in place themselves, rather than either follow or draw down from EU law. That was new for the UK government, and so I think something they struggled to deal with. So yeah, I think they did make a lot of mistakes, and I think there were lots of, in terms of the frontline politicians, there were lots of egos at play and things like that, which complicated the process. But behind the scenes, there were a lot of people who were just trying to work out what to do and struggling to deal with the pace of change for all the industries that were affected by the sanctions, all walks of life, really. So I suppose you've got two things going on at the same time, where there were lots of people who were just trying to do their best but struggling, and then the political elite who were maybe using it for other purposes, and that really left Chelsea in the middle of a very difficult situation.
How we should assess Roman Abramovich's role in all of this? Because from your book, my impression is that maybe Roman Abramovich wasn't as bad as the government and media say.
I think what I've purposely tried to do in the book is present the story, present the facts and findings and research, but not make open comments on those, because it didn't really feel like it was my place to do that. But I completely understand what you're saying. I think what's very difficult is that, and certainly what we're seeing for anyone who has profile now in any situation in the world, and for politics in general, is that, and social media I think has made a real impact on this, is that I'm sure every individual would think this about themselves. No one person is one thing, are they? Everyone's very complicated, have lots of different sides. I think if somebody tried to judge me on everything I'd done, I wouldn't say it's perfect, and I'm sure everyone thinks the same thing. I think there are obviously very complicated elements of Roman Abramovich's life and background, but I don't think he's ever tried to shy away from any of that. So I think he's been very open about everything that's happened to him, really. And I think really it comes down to the fact that when he bought the club in 2003, yes, it was a very different political climate, but he was very welcomed and very readily accepted, considered a suitable fit owner for a Premier League football club. And that situation continued until the Skripal poisoning in March 2018. And the relationship between the UK and Russia changed markedly after that. And so how he was viewed and how he felt he was received in the UK changed from then on. And eventually, when the sanctions came, obviously he had no choice but to sell, and he'd already realised he would have to, so he'd put the club up for sale before he was actually sanctioned. I think that he's been consistent with what he did with Chelsea when he was owner and what he's tried to do in the sale. So I think he deserves a great deal of credit for that. I think certainly it's fair to say that what happened in the process of the sale was that, I think it's completely fair to say that the sanctions are politically motivated. That's exactly what they're there for. That's right. Obviously, he suffers from that, but I think he in reality would be quite relaxed about the reality of that. And yeah, I think for Chelsea, he has changed the club's history entirely. So his legacy, I think, remains with Chelsea intact, and also he's obviously tried very hard to, and still wants the money from the sale to go to a humanitarian foundation, and so he still wants to donate that money. That's still the case. So I think he deserves credit for that too.
Why haven't the funds for these humanitarian causes been released yet?
Because he's still sanctioned and those funds are still frozen. So when the sale was completed, the funds that effectively bought the club, paid for the club, were cleared into a Barclays UK bank account, and they're still there because asset is still frozen. And so the government would need to grant another license to release those funds. And there's an ongoing dispute between the government and Roman Abramovich about the wording of the documents for the sale, the document that licensed the sale itself. So government wants the funds to be used exclusively inside Ukraine, and Roman Abramovich and people around him want that money to be used for a global humanitarian organization. And so Mike Penrose, who is the former chief executive of UNICEF UK, he is the guy who would head up the foundation. He's got more than 30 years experience in humanitarianism and is completely independent of anything else in the process. And his argument is that if you were only to use the money to spend it inside Ukraine, then it wouldn't be effective at all, and it would effectively, it would waste that money. I can see the reasoning of not wanting Russia to benefit, for example. However, what Mike is saying, and I know this to be the case, is that upwards of £2.35 billion, if invested properly and used wisely, that money effectively could never run out and could be used to change the face of humanitarian aid globally forever. It would be the single biggest humanitarian donation in history. So, as much as there are political wranglings, there is also an enormous amount of money that could be used for, almost unimaginably positive, purposes in plenty of different emergency situations all across the world. And, certainly I would hope that they can still find a way to release that money, but still, so far, nothing has changed.
His problems with entering the UK appeared in 2019-17. Why did Roman sell Chelsea so late?
I think what was clear was that he didn't really want to sell. I think he loved owning the club and running the club, and I think he wanted to keep doing that. I think he didn't sort of express it to me in this way, but I think drawing together from the things he did say, I think he had probably hoped that the situation would change and improve again. Sort of political relations and wider relations would improve, and things would go back to how they had been before, which would have given him a better platform to continue running the club and a better feel in London again. And I think there's that. I think also there's the case that if he ever were to sell, I think he was determined that he would only sell the club to people who could carry the club on in the manner to which it had become accustomed under his ownership. So a group of owners who could keep the club at the same level. And I think ideally he would have liked that to be as close to his way of running things as possible, which would have meant one individual really. But actually, in the course of his tenure owning the Premier League, he transformed it first, but then others followed suit, and more money came into the Premier League, of course, and football more widely after that. One of the things we're finding now is that there's so much money, the sums of money involved in owning and running a football club are so vast that it's almost beyond the means of one individual. I mean, the richest men in the world, richest people in the world, someone like an Elon Musk, of course, or Jeff Bezos, for example, they could, if they wanted to buy a Premier League club outright, they could do it. They could run it under their own steam. But most people, even billionaires, they now need the backing of a major financial fund. And so I think that the interest that had been there across the years hadn't, in terms of individuals who are interested, I don't think anything ever stacked up to something that Roman Abramovich considered would be suitable or would be good enough for Chelsea, if that makes sense. So I think that's another thing that played into it as well. I think he's obviously a very astute businessman, so he and his team did their due diligence all the time. So they were aware of the kinds of people who were interested, and I don't think that they were suitable. Todd Boehly had his interest, but that didn't develop beyond initial conversations. So that never got to the point of an all-out bid or anything like that at that point. But the conversations, obviously, that had happened then, and the relationships that have built clearly stood, Todd Boehly in good stead. And so that certainly helped when it came to the race for and the bidding for Chelsea eventually. And so, yeah, I think overall, he wouldn't have sold if he didn't have to. But I think when he made the decision to put Chelsea up for sale in advance of being sanctioned, I think that was he was doing some talking through his actions to the UK government at the same time, and that talking was to say, I think I know what's coming. I hope it doesn't happen. But in the meantime, this is a big gesture. This is me sort of taking my hands off, stepping back, and showing to you that I understand the situation and I'm acting accordingly. And I think he probably hoped that might be sufficient, but obviously then sanctions were forthcoming anyway. So
why did Boehly and Clearlake Capital win the race? What was the most important aspects in their offer?
Yeah, because when it came down to the final stages, I think the final bidders were largely offering the same kinds of pledges, the same kinds of things. Everybody had come to the same amount of money in terms of the bid, so the final sale price wasn't going to fluctuate depending on for the final three bidders. So that was quite set. The pledges that people had been making were quite set, and so I think what set Todd Boehly and Badad Iqbali and Clearlake apart was in the process of running the sale and meeting all the people and meeting the candidates and going through all the assessments. It was Bruce Buck and Marina Granovskaya and Rainbank who were running that, and I think that Bruce Buck and Marina Granovskaya eventually came to the point of thinking that that Todd and Badad were the people who probably had the most in common in terms of their mindset with Roman Abramovich in terms of how they would look to run the club in a similar fashion. So I think that struck a chord, and I think that was probably the thing in the end that tipped the balance in their favour. The ability to be fairly agile, given obviously the constraints of a massive business, but also to be able to to make strong decisions, quick ones, take decisive actions and move the club forward. Obviously, we've seen the size and scale and speed of the investment that they've put into the squad and other things. So they haven't been holding back, have they? And so I think all of those things, filtered in really, and I think those are the things that mark them out. So in the end, I think certainly some of the knowledge that Todd had acquired from the conversations in 2019 definitely helped.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, across the lengths of conversations they would have had, obviously, everyone got to know each other very well. So I think it in the end, some of that probably comes down to feel, really.
How important were the fans during the process? Because your book describes their rebellion against the Ricketts family. Were the fans important at all?
I think the protest against the Super League, I think that sort of did set a precedent and stuck in people's minds of the people who were involved in the hierarchy. Obviously, that the protests there were crucial in enforcing, the English clubs to pull out. Chelsea were, among the first to do that, and to kind of, to react to such a strong resistance. And yeah, they were, because I think that the fan sentiment was going to be really important. I think whoever was going to take over had to have, the backing of the fans and the support of them, because that effectively created a mandate, didn't it, really? So the process of winning the race to buy Chelsea, that involved an awful lot of public relations, which is, and that's, there's potentially never going to be another football sale like it, because I was reporting on the sale during that period of time as it was happening, and I'm certainly not alone in this. I know other journalists who were reporting on the sale as well had similar things. You'd be receiving phone calls from advisors to people who would be bidding, and they were calling to say, I represent X person or Y person. They are going to make a bid for Chelsea, and we would like you to report that, make that publicise it. And obviously, in normal circumstances, we'd only hear about or find out about takeovers when they're at the end, when they're in the final stages, and effectively when people are ready to announce that it's going to happen. So it was an unprecedented set of circumstances, and an absorbing and engrossing, but also slightly surreal period of time. So the fans, because of that, and because whoever was going to win the right to buy the club, because of the political situation with the war in Ukraine, whoever was going to be in that position, in pole position, would need strong government backing. All of those things played into the fact that the fans were important, and what they did think was important. And I think what we did see with the Ricketts situation was they had been starting to turn the tide and win some of the supporters over who had been skeptical of the family for all the reasons that were discussed, and they were just about making some headway when pulled out because of issues behind the scene, obviously, that are in the book about the different partners in the bid. So but I think the fact that all the parties who were involved in the different consortiums, the fact that they were so keen to win the favour of the supporters, it definitely does show how important and influential they were and are. And I think that's important for football and sport more broadly, that it's still the case that fans and supporters can be that influential, and when they are united, they can have a really impactful voice.
I remember that at the time there was a lot of talks about Saudi media as a potential new owner. From your book, it seems that they weren't serious competitor.
They never got that far into the process. They were out of the running quite early on. And so I don't doubt that they would have had the ability to run the club. And I'm sure that they would have been able to provide all the funds necessary and all the kind of infrastructure and everything that would go with that. I think that because of the delicate political situation, because of the war in Ukraine, I think that what Rainbank, who are running the process, they knew that they would need eventual government sign-off even though the government weren't overseeing the process, and so did everyone else. And so actually, in the end, what was going to be needed, and because there was there was no spare time, it meant that what they needed above all else was a completely cast iron bid in terms of background and all those sorts of things, so that once it was put to the government, they could be completely confident that that they would be ratified. And because there wouldn't have been any time, if at that stage a bid hadn't been ratified, the government had decided for whatever reason that a bid wouldn't be fit and proper, then there wouldn't have been time potentially to go back to one of the other bidders and put them through the final parts of the process. And that would have been something where the final deadline more than likely would have been broken. And you can see with the bids that were taken to the final stage, they were all quite similar, all largely North American backing and similar kind of makeup. There's a clear reason for that, because I think that all of the people involved, they didn't have the luxury of taking anything like any kind of risk with what they would be presenting to the government at the final stage, really.
So if not Boehly, Clearlake, who do you think had the best chance of taking over the club?
Well, I think what's interesting is that I think that any of the bids that were in the final reckoning, I think any of them, and I think this is what lots of people who are involved in the process have said, I think any of them would have done a very good job of running the football club. Sir Martin Broughton, what he did for Liverpool in the past is very crucial in putting them onto the footing, putting them back onto the footing to where they are now. So he's obviously, he's a man of great standing and knows how to run a football club. And with the backing that they had of Harris and Blitzer, obviously we've seen what they've gone on and bought the Commanders and the Washington Commanders, the NFL team. That bid had, even though that bid started off with concerns about the funding, I think in the end, there's the money wasn't an issue there either. It was extremely well funded and very robust financially on that front as well, with people who know sport, know elite sport, and know how to move things on there too. And I think with Paliuka as well, he had he's got a lot of experience in elite sport as well. So, and somebody very well regarded, and everyone involved was impressed with everything they put together as well. And I do think that the Ricketts bid was very strong. And I think if they hadn't pulled out, I think it would have been interesting. There are quite a few people who are involved that potentially thought that was the bid that would have offered the biggest challenge had they not pulled out to Boehly and Clearlake. But I think it has to, all respect has to go to Todd and Badad and the Boehly Clearlake bid and its full consortium for how they brought everything together.
Why did Marina and Petr Cech decide not to stay at the club? Couldn't they have helped the new owners avoid mistakes in the early stages of running the club? Maybe Chelsea wouldn't have Sterling of their books now.
I think that was the initial plan. I think initially they had wanted, the new owners wanted Bruce, Marina and Petr to stay for effectively an extended handover period, which would have been 6 months, perhaps longer. But as that unfolded, it was effectively made clear to them that the change needed to be larger than simply Roman Abramovich himself departing. So I think it was considered that. So as the deal was being finalised, I think it was basically the government's unofficial position, but I think that's what it was. But it was their position that they needed more people to leave for it to be considered, a fresh start. And so in that situation, the new owners, they had people in mind. They had people they'd identified to run the sporting side of things. They knew who they wanted, a group of targets for sporting directors' roles and similar, but they hadn't been able to, or they hadn't thought they would need to have somebody to start on day one. So because of that change at at such a late stage, that's the reason why Todd Boehly stepped into that role. And so that was a bit of a baptism of fire for him, and obviously, for Chelsea in that change. I do think that whatever had happened in that summer, there'd have been a big change. I think it would have had to be, I think, at the end of one era and the start of another. I don't think it's very easy at all to just sort of move on seamlessly. So, and I think because the other thing to that is that because Roman Abramovich was able to and did run Chelsea independently throughout the course of his entire ownership, the structure that they had in place was very small. They didn't need lots of people. But I think that now there aren't really any clubs that run like that now. I think unless you are an individual in total control of the club, you can't run a club like that. So it was never going to be, that structure was never going to be transferable in itself. So they would have had to change it at some point. That change just came faster than it otherwise would have done. And I think for Petr, he took the decision to step away, and he could have stayed, but he took that decision because he felt like the new owners had earned the right to take the club in, whichever direction they wanted, and he felt like he wanted to respect their chance to take things in their own way.
Looking back now over these 3 years, what do you think are the biggest mistakes Chelsea's new owner have made, and what has been their biggest success?
I would say mistake. I'd be hard to sort of criticize them heavily for mistakes. I think if they had been, I think the difficulty of Todd Boehly stepping into that role in that summer was that other clubs might have seen an opportunity to exploit his lack of experience in that role, and as we know, it's a very, very tough negotiating business, isn't it? Football to get for people to get what they want in terms of transfers or things like that. I think so. I think that was something that they didn't really have any choice on. But I think if they'd had a different option, it would have been different. Actually, I think though the learning curve that came with that will stand them in great stead in the long run. I think it already has done. I think that there was probably a bit of a culture personality clash with Thomas Tuchel, which is a real shame. But you can sort of understand why, knowing the different characters and what they want. I think the new owners want a much more corporate style structure with regular flowing open communication. And Thomas is a very charismatic man, but he wants to coach the football on the pitch and not worry about anything else. And so I think he loved. Well, I know that he loved his time working in the Abramovich setup because he would just coach and not worry about anything else. The new owners needed something else, and they needed more from their head coach, especially at that period of time. They needed guidance, really. And I think that the demands and the way that Thomas coaches, he is so specific and demanding that his methods require an awful lot of, I think, 100% of his focus has to go onto the coaching. The two agendas clashed there, and that then obviously led to problems, which led to him leaving. The rationale of bringing in Graham Potter made complete sense, but I think that job was too soon for him. So and obviously it didn't work out. It didn't work out, did it? So I think that those two things are probably the things that caused the biggest the biggest issues early on, really. That Thomas leaving and it not working out for Graham Potter then led to an extended period of time where Chelsea had to find their feet again. And I think they have done that now. I mean, success is obviously the Club World Cup. That I think that's clearly the biggest success in the European trophy as well. There's lots of cause for optimism.
What are the biggest challenges for the new administration? The new stadium, the academy. What do you think would be the hardest part to make this step to be the club that can really be a top club and fight compete with Man City or Liverpool?
Yeah, I think the stadium is the thing. I think that's a good point. I think I'd say when Skripal happened, Chelsea were 1 day away from starting work on the new stadium. Then they pulled the project because Roman Abramovich didn't feel comfortable in London, didn't feel welcome with what was happening, and he felt that he questioned whether he would decided that, to put at least a pause on the project, because why would he do something like that in a place where he no longer felt welcome. And obviously that was borne out by what happened next. Had that happened then, that would have given Chelsea a huge boost. It obviously didn't happen, and I think now what you've seen with Tottenham Stadium and other similar setups elsewhere, it's vital to have a state-of-the-art ground just for every for every element, and Chelsea need to find their solution to that. Obviously, there are lots of different issues to whether they stay at Stamford Bridge or move somewhere else. But I think the best case scenario is they can stay where they are and rebuild. That's not an easy process, and I think that it also is something, as we saw with Tottenham, it will take a lot of time and focus and energy of the ownership. So I think one of the biggest challenges they'll have is pulling off that project while also making sure that they don't lose any focus from what's happening on the pitch. And so I think it was one thing for Tottenham to put their rationale together, and Arsenal before them when they built the Emirates Stadium as well. The rationale of, well, we're investing in the ground, so we have to potentially put the handbrake on investing in the squad. But I don't think that's going to be acceptable, or I don't think that will work for Chelsea. I think that's also something they're acutely aware of. I don't think they're not the sorts of people who want to slow down in any respect. So, but I think that will be the biggest challenge, is balancing those two work streams, if you like, at the same time, making sure that whatever is happening with the stadium project or process, that no focus or attention is lost from what's happening on the pitch.